I usually make a huge mess when I sew, and my skirt is completely covered with fluff and thread, so I wanted to stitch a protective garment. The aprons I made earlier aren't really practical for sewing, as I have to take them off every time I need to try something on. I had this decades-old striped cotton. Unfortunately, there were too many defects in the fabric. It was only 80 centimeters, 32 inches wide, and I didn't have much of it. The ends hadn't been cut evenly, so I wanted to rip them straight. When ripping the fabric, the edges may become a bit distorted, but pressing them usually fixes the problem. Unless the fabric either becomes distorted in the pre-wash or is originally deformed, which happened to me, so I ended up with a shape where the long edges weren't of equal length. Then I found another big defect in the fabric, which was far from the edge, so it couldn't be cut off. I divided the fabric into 3 equal parts by folding it. I wanted to use the pattern of the front center panel of my 1898 walking skirt. You don't need a pattern, you can simply draw a few lines or cut a similar shape straight from the fabric. I had the pattern, so I used it. I cut the fabric along the folds. It was too late when I realized that the top layer was shorter than the other two. I folded the edge of one of the rectangles and placed the pattern on it. Then I thought I would try to match the stripes and pin the fabric in a few places. I made the bottom of the panel as long as possible. On hindsight, I should have left it straight instead of curving it. I cut off the selvage on the 2 other rectangles. I matched the side edge of the pattern to one of the long edges of the rectangles. I needed that curve, but not the curve of the waistline. Then I placed the center panel on the 2 other panels to see how much I needed to cut from them at the bottom. That was a lot. I really should have divided the original length into 3 with more care. You can see how deformed the fabric was. I backstitched the seams. I stitched along the straight grain of the big panels and not on the bias grain of the front center panel. This way I didn't need to draw a guiding line and I could sew fairly quickly. However, this also meant that the ugly side of the stitching was in the center panel. You usually fold the seam allowances towards the back, hiding the wrong side of the stitching. Here I would have hidden the beautiful side of the stitches, leaving the ugly side to be seen. I decided to file the seam allowances separately, hiding both sides of the stitching. I gathered the top edge from the seams. I decided I could cut strips for the waistband from the edges of the big panels. You can see one, but I cut two, one from each panel. Then I folded the edges of the panels twice. I made as narrow a hem as I could. I basted one of the strips on the waistline. I backstitched from seam to seam. I made the gathers very dense, as dense as possible. I cut the other strip into two. I placed one of the short strips on the waistband at right angles and right sides together. Then I made a diagonal seam. It would have been much easier if I hadn't attached the waistband first. You may ask why I didn't join the two strips end to end. In that case, I would have the seam exactly where you cross the ties, so there would be too much tension on the seam. You may also ask why I didn't join the very ends with a simple vertical seam. There's less bulking when you use the diagonal seam, and I think there's less tension on each stitch. So I lengthened both ends in the same way, then I looked at the ends that I cut off and realized I had messed it up. You see the pencil mark. I should have matched the left hand side edge of the short strip to the mark and not the right hand side edge as I did. I finished attaching the waistband. Then I folded the ties right sides together. I backstitched the ties. This time I left the ends square. I clipped the corner where the two seams met. I turned the ties to the right side. To make pressing the ties much easier, I gently rolled the edge between my fingers and thumbs, then used my nails to flatten it. Pressing isn't even always necessary. I folded the edge of the inside waistband. I basted it into place. Then I whipped it. Finally, I folded the bottom of the apron twice and whipped it. I made the hem narrow because I wanted the apron to be as long as possible. Wider hems are better if you're aiming for a nicer silhouette. The apron is still full of basting thread and I still have to do a lot of stitching, however, I have to take a break and rest my index finger.